So from a literary standpoint, Job is divided neatly into three parts. The prologue section, which is chapter 1 and 2, where we sort of read about who Job is, we read about his family, we read about his initial suffering. It sort of sets up the story. The prologue section of Job sets up the story, chapters 1 and 2. And then it goes from the prologue section to the dialogue section, which is chapters 3 through 42, verse 6. And that's the biggest section of Job, where Job and his friends and God, they're all dialoguing, they're talking. There's a big conversation happening. And then we get to the epilogue section, chapter 42, verses 7 through 17, the verses I just read. And that's the section where the story is summed up, so to speak. The definition for epilogue, the formal definition for epilogue is this: a section or a speech at the end of a book or at the end of a play that serves as a comment on or a conclusion to all that has happened. So it's a closing word, so to speak, and there's just so much here, so much in these verses. I could preach a lot of sermons on these verses alone, on just the epilogue section alone. I could talk about how Job's suffering qualified him to be a mediator between God and Job's sinful friends, and what a beautiful picture that is of Jesus, whose own suffering on the cross qualified him to be our mediator. I mean, that's a whole sermon right there. It's weeks of sermons right there. Or I could talk about how Job's family comes back around only after all of Job's fortunes are restored, and how real friends are realized when you're at the bottom, not the top, when you're at your worst, not your best. I could preach for a year on that. Or I could talk about how God restoring all of Job's fortunes times 2 is not, categorically not, a promise that God will give us health, wealth, and prosperity if we are simply faithful and do the right thing. There are a lot of people who have read the end of Job and come to that conclusion. If we do the right thing, and if we're faithful, and if we hold up under scrutiny and under suffering, then God will reward us with goods and riches here and now. That's not what this section is about at all. No, it's a picture with a promise. It's a picture of how the best is yet to come. It's a promise that Jesus is coming back, and when he does, the peace on earth announced the night he was born will become a universal and permanent actuality. Those verses that talk about God restoring Job's fortunes times 2, it's a promise that one day everything crooked will be made straight and everything rough will be made smooth. It's a promise that every wrong will one day be righted, and there will one day be no more sickness, no more death, no more tears, no more division, no more tension. It's a promise that one day everything sad will come untrue. It's a promise that the best is yet to come. I could preach on that for the rest of my life. For the rest of my life. This is a time of year, especially when we need to be reminded of that, because so often during the holiday season, hurts are brought to the surface. Failures, a sense of guilt, shame, regret, loss, whatever the case may be, comes to the surface. And it's in those moments we need desperately to be reminded that this world is not all that there is, and that the best is yet to come. And that there will one day come a time when everything sad will come untrue, everything crooked will be made straight, everything rough will be made smooth. All of our frustrations, all of our tensions, all of our unmet longings will forever be taken care of. That is a great promise, and those verses, the verses I just read, are a reminder of that. It's not some half-assed promise that if we're good, God will give us good stuff here and now. If we're good and we give and we're generous, then maybe God will be generous to us. God will be good to us. That's not what's going on here. This is a much bigger promise than that. It's a promise that one day everything will be made right. So I could preach on that for the rest of my life. I could preach on all those things. I could preach on that. I could preach on his friends and family coming back. I love that part. So funny. If it wasn't funny, I'd cry. If it wasn't so sad, I wouldn't laugh. Whatever the case may be. I mean, the fact that they all come back. After he was restored all of his fortunes, they all came back. They all returned. That's happened to me on a couple of occasions, and I have a visceral reaction to it. So I'm not exactly sure how Job responded, but it sounded like he responded fairly well to that. And I think it's such a beautiful, beautiful picture about what God says about Job's friends and how serious of a crime it is to speak about God falsely, to speak about God in a way that makes people feel heavy. That should be a sermon preached to every preacher in the world. That if you leave your people at the end of a sermon thinking more about what they need to do for God rather than what God has done for them, it's like you're tying a millstone around their neck and throwing them in the depths of the sea. And Jesus said it is dangerous to do that. So it's interesting how God takes so seriously how wrongfully we can speak about him in a way that ties people up. A God that's all about legalism rather than grace, which Job's friends were. And so what does God do? Because of Job's suffering, Job is now qualified to go and serve as a mediator between God and Job's sinful friends. And what a beautiful, accurate picture that is of what Jesus has done for us. So I could preach on all that stuff, but I want to conclude this series by sort of giving my own epilogue, my own closing word, so to speak. This is such a huge subject. We've been looking at the subject of suffering now for 11 sermons, and it's such a huge, huge subject, and there's so much more that I would love to be able to say, but I want to just finish this series by sort of giving my own last word, my own epilogue. I began this series by saying that when most of us think about suffering, we think of tragedies like death and disease and divorce and depression and things like that, big stuff, crises. But suffering, as we've seen week in and week out, suffering is so much bigger than that. It's so much broader than that. Suffering may take the form of a crisis like divorce or death, but more often it's daily irritations like resentment, like loneliness, like disappointment. Suffering may be the shocking news of a brain tumor, or it can be something more ordinary like a strained relationship that never seems to get any easier. That's the suffering that most of us are acquainted with. Everyday stuff like frustration and regret and anxiety and fear and insecurity, stress, shame, unmet expectations. That's all suffering too. It's not just the big stuff. It's stuff like that too. This nagging sense of guiltiness, fear of the future. The feeling of being misunderstood, rejected, the feeling of being unloved, unsure. That's all suffering too. It's not just the big stuff, it's that stuff too. We all suffer in big ways and small ways. Pain is pervasive. Trouble is everywhere. We've looked at that week in and week out. And we all know that when it comes to suffering, there's no such thing as getting a grip on yourself or snapping out of it. Even though that's what we're told sometimes by people with good intentions, just get over it, snap out of it. It's not that bad. We know that there's no such thing. When you are in a crucible of ache, there's no such thing as snapping out of it. There's no such thing as simply turning the light on and getting over it. Job knew this firsthand. If this story teaches us anything at all, it teaches us that there are no pat answers to pain. None. But that doesn't stop us from trying to come up with some. Even though in reality there are no pat answers to pain, we still strain to come up with pat answers to pain. We do so all the time. We don't know what to do with suffering. We don't know what to do with trouble. We try to make sense of it. And in the process, we often make it worse. I said early on that we never just suffer the thing we're suffering. We also suffer the way that we're suffering the thing we're suffering. Okay, I'll say that again. That is a sentence lifted from an old friend of mine. And it's exactly right. that when it comes to suffering, it's not just that we suffer the thing that we're suffering. We also suffer the way that we're suffering the thing we're suffering, okay? Now, what that means is this. We tend to make our trouble worse by the way we handle our trouble. By the way we handle it, by the way we approach suffering, the way we think about it, the way we handle it, the way we feel about it. What we tell others and what we tell ourselves regarding suffering often makes the suffering worse. So we end up not just suffering the thing, but we end up suffering the way that we're suffering the thing, which compounds the suffering. It's what Job experienced with his friends. It wasn't just that he lost his children and lost his wealth and lost his livelihood and lost his health. That was bad enough. But then his friends roll around and they start telling him things like, Job, we know how the world works and we know how God works. Good people get good stuff. Bad people get bad stuff. You're clearly getting bad stuff. What did you do wrong? Well, now Job's not just suffering what he lost, but he's suffering the way he's being counseled to suffer. Compounds the suffering. We do that to ourselves. We do that to one another. We moralize it. We say things like, it's okay because you're going to become a better person as a result of it. Okay, we say things like that. We moralize it. You're going to improve as a result of this, so it's okay. We minimize it. You know, as bad as it is, could be worse. Okay, look on the bright side, could be worse. We suppress it. We ignore it, hoping it will just go away with time. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it. Just let's not talk about it. We compare it. Well, at least I don't have it as bad as he does. I mean, things are kind of sucky right now, but man, she's going through some real sucky stuff. At least my suckiness isn't as bad as her suckiness, okay? We compare it all the time. This is the way we typically handle suffering. We handle it by the way, we handle it wrongly, not only because of what we hear other people counseling us, but by what we counsel ourselves. The person who speaks to you more than anybody else is yourself. It is, and so if we don't understand at some deep level how to suffer, we will suffer more. We tend to invalidate people's pain all the time, but we don't just invalidate other people's pain. We oftentimes invalidate our own pain by these things, minimizing it, moralizing it, ignoring it, suppressing it, comparing it. And one of the reasons why we don't know what to do with pain and trouble is because we have unrealistic expectations of what life is supposed to look like and feel like in this fallen world, in this broken world. If you're going to be prepared for pain and trouble, you better have a strong theology of the fall. Okay, the fall, I'm not talking about the season that comes before winter and that comes after summer. I'm talking about what happened to this world a long time ago. Genesis, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 tell this story. It tells us that God made everything good, and that we then broke every good thing God made, and as a result, this world and everyone in it is twisted out of shape. Okay, it's what Cornelius Plantinga calls the vandalism of shalom. Shalom being that Hebrew word which talks about all things being at peace, all things being integrated, all things being harmonious, all things working the way they ought to work. And he calls sin the vandalism of shalom because sin tends to break things apart. It toxifies things, it divides things, it disintegrates things. It ruins harmony. So we know that nothing is as it should be. We know it. We feel it in our bones. We know it. All of us and the world we live in is comprehensively dislocated. Comprehensively. Things are broken. The fabric of our lives and the fabric of this world is tattered. It's torn. You have to be blind, deaf, and dumb to not see that. I mean, this world is not the way it ought to be. We know that. We know that things are broken. We know that this world and everything in it is tattered and torn. That's the state of our world and everything in it. I love the way the Apostle Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 8. He says this, that the whole world is groaning, waiting for redemption, he says. We live, in other words, in a groaning world. Well, you groan when you're in pain. You groan when you're in distress. You groan when you need help. You groan when you long for something better. That's when we groan. We live in a world where we can expect hardship, difficulty, pain, and sorrow because this world is broken. It's not functioning the way God originally intended for it to function. Now, one day it will. We already talked about that. That day is coming, but that day is not now. We live in a period of history that theologians refer to as the already and the not yet. That we've already been rescued truly, but we have not yet been rescued fully. The comparison that they often use is the Israelites after being released from slavery in Egypt, but not yet having entered the promised land. And that season, those years where they wandered in the wilderness between slavery and fulfilled promise, that's our life. That's the wilderness that we live in, the already and the not yet. We've already been rescued and delivered this amazing promise, but that promise has not yet been fulfilled fully in that regard. And so we live in a groaning world. It's not functioning the way God intended. It's not functioning the way it will one day function. And one reason this is so helpful to know is because it means your suffering is not a sign that you're being punished. We've looked at this week in and week out. That was the mistake that Job's friends made. That's what they said about God. We see now what God thinks about how they spoke of him. I mean, this posture that suffering is a sign of bad behavior and you are being punished by God directly because of it. That is not speaking truthfully of God. It's not speaking rightly of God. And it's important to know that because this world is not functioning the way it ought to function, it's broken, it's tattered, it's torn, that the reason it's so helpful, one of the reasons it's so helpful to know that is because it means that our suffering is not a sign that we're being punished. Our blessings are never payment for the good we've done, and our trials are never punishment for the wrongs we've done. That sort of cause and effect equation is always bad spiritual math. Always. It's not good. That God gives good things to good people and he gives bad things to bad people. And that God is up in the heavens doling out misery in proportion to our sin and bad behavior. That is the way that Job's friends spoke about God. That was their theology. And God had something to say about that at the end. God had harsh words to say about a theology that makes God out to be some cosmic genie that's doling out misery in proportion to our sin and doling out blessings according to our good behavior. Our blessings are never a payment for the good we've done, and our trials are never punishment for the wrongs we've done. Rather, our trouble is a sign that we live in a world that doesn't function the way God intended. And it's groaning for renewal, the way you are, the way I am. And if you don't embrace that, you end up expecting things to be way better than they're ever going to be here and now. If you don't embrace that, if you have this sort of Pollyanna, optimistic, rose-colored glasses view of the world, that everybody's good and progress is inevitable and mankind's basically good and we're basically good people who may do bad things once in a while, if that's your theology, you are going to be shocked every time someone fails you. We talked last week about the difference between having a high anthropology, I can accomplish anything, and having a low anthropology. Meaning we're not the strong, capable, independent people we might like to believe we are. And if you think you are, you're either turning a blind eye to reality or one day reality is going to smack you in the face. And so having this understanding of why the world is the way that it is, why am I the way that I am, why am I this barrel of contradictions? Why do I believe and not believe, trust and not trust? Why do I tell the truth and lie? What is going on with me? I am a barrel of contradictions. We all are. Martin Luther said that we are all simul justus et peccator, which is Latin for we are simultaneously justified, made right with God, and sinful. Both of those things, all at the same time. We're a mixed bag of stuff. And if we don't recognize that, we will be shocked every time we fail ourselves, and we'll be shocked every time someone fails us. I said a few weeks ago that two sobering things I've learned since my own personal collapse nearly 8 years ago is this, that you are capable of failing in a way that is unthinkable to you right now. The second thing is that God's grace and mercy is big enough to cover the fact that your greatest failure may be ahead of you. That's a proper low anthropology. It's realistic. That's why churches ought to be, and I pray increasingly so that this church is, a place where sin doesn't shock and grace still amazes. One of the reasons why grace ceases to amaze us is because we don't think we really need it that bad. But spiritual maturity is nothing more and nothing less than a growing realization of just how much grace we need. I mean, that's what it is. It's this increasing realization that I am small and I need God. That I need God's forgiveness, I need God's grace, I need God's mercy. And when we cry out to Him with that realization, it's not that He's giving us a new grace or a new forgiveness or a new mercy. What He's giving us instead is a reacquaintance with the grace and the forgiveness and the mercy we've always had. And so we want this place to be a place where sin doesn't shock and grace still amazes. I always chuckle when I'm entering into a conversation with somebody who's like, now, you're the pastor, and I feel kind of silly telling you this about myself. It's a confession of sorts, something bad that they've done or thought or failed to do or whatever. And I'm like, man, you have no idea, okay? Not only have I heard just about everything under the sun over the last 20-something years, but I know my own heart well enough now to know that the doctrine of total depravity is true. Okay, now, sometimes people get confused when those two words are put together, total depravity, and they think, well, is he saying that people are as bad as they could possibly be? No, of course not, thankfully. Even God's restraining grace keeps the worst of us from becoming worse. Okay? Total depravity is the idea that sin has affected us in the totality of our being, that there's no part of our constitution that is sin-free. There's no part of us that is perfect. It's all tainted. Our thinking capacities are tainted by sin. Our feeling capacities are tainted by sin. Our doing capacities are tainted by sin. All of it is tainted by it. So even there is something in even our best works that needs to be pardoned by God. Okay? I think it was William Beveridge who said that even our tears of repentance need to be washed in the blood of Jesus. Okay? So that's, when you understand that about yourself and the people around you and the world around you, man, you're less shocked by tragedy and trouble. It doesn't mean that tragedy and trouble doesn't hurt anymore. It doesn't mean that tragedy and trouble are somehow okay and you can smile through it. No, it's bad, it's hard, but there's a difference between having to suffer through tragedy and trouble and pain and misfortune. It's one thing to say I have to suffer through that. It's another thing to be completely shocked by it. Like, this isn't supposed to happen. I'm a good guy. This isn't supposed to happen to me. I've done everything right. I've crossed my T's and I've dotted my I's and I've done everything correctly. Why is this happening? Why is this happening to my son? Why is this happening to my daughter? Why is this happening to my friend, my mom, my dad, my cousin, my aunt, my uncle? Why is this happening? I mean, I've done everything I should do. I work harder than everyone in the office. Why did I lose my job? Why did she get the promotion? When we realize that this world is twisted out of shape and the people in it are twisted out of shape, we're then not shocked when things around us begin to fall apart. We live in a world where we can expect hardship, difficulty, and pain because this world is broken. And everything in this world is broken. A religion of human goodness and strength is never helpful in times of personal disaster. Okay, never. This idea that, if I just focus, pull myself up by my bootstraps. I can accomplish anything. That's sort of high anthropology. An elevated view of ourselves and what we can accomplish in our capacities. That falls flat in the face of failure and loss. Okay, a religion of human goodness, a religion of human strength, of human potential and capability is never helpful in times of personal disaster. Never. High anthropology falls flat in the face of failure, always. So the bad news is that our suffering isn't going away just yet. It will one day, but not yet. The bad news is that our suffering isn't going away just yet. But the good news is, either is God. His promise to walk with us through the valley of the shadow of death, to be in it with us, His promise to never leave us, to never forsake us, that promise holds true. And we become especially aware of it when things are falling apart. When everybody seems to be walking away, when we feel like we're losing it all, whatever that might be. Maybe your health is failing and you feel like you're losing your life. Maybe someone you love's health is failing and you feel like you're losing something you can't live without. In those moments, God promises, I'm there. And we become acutely aware of that when we're feeling low, when we're feeling desperate, when we're feeling strong and capable. Then sometimes we don't feel that desperation as acutely, and in those moments, maybe we don't recognize just how much we need God. But when things are falling apart, when life goes south, those are typically the moments when we realize God's still with me. He's still here. Everything else and everyone else may be bailing, but God's still here. See, God is interested in you, not the photoshopped version of you, not the version that you try so desperately, that I try so desperately to put out there so that we can find love and acceptance from the world around us. That's not the version. That's not the version He's interested in. He's interested in you, the you who suffers, the you who inflicts suffering on others. I was having a conversation for a minute before the service and said, and you've heard me say this before, but the Christian community typically does a pretty good job of ministering to sufferers who are suffering because of what someone else has done to them. But the Christian community has done a horrific job in ministering to sufferers who are suffering because of what they've done to themselves. To those people, we go, you made your bed, buddy, you sleep in it, okay? This person over here, the victim gets grace, the perpetrator doesn't. God doesn't make that distinction. We're all victims, we're all perpetrators. Okay, we all suffer and we all inflict suffering on others. All of us. None of us is without blame in that regard. That's the you He's interested in, the you who hides. The you who has bad days, the you who wants to quit, the you who is tired of being afraid, the you who's struggling to believe, the you who doesn't know whether any of this is true or not, the you who seemingly goes right back to the same dry cistern over and over and over again. That you, the you who runs, the you who wanders, the you who acts foolishly instead of wisely. The you who should know better by now, but seemingly hasn't learned your lesson. That's the you, the real broken, tattered, and torn you. That's the you that God loves. That's the you that God is interested in. That's the you that God attends to. It's that you. I've said before that it's been said that the deepest longing of the human heart is to be simultaneously fully known and fully loved. And it's not just Christian people who say that. People who understand the human condition say that. And we think that if we're fully known, we won't be fully loved, because no one could possibly love me as I am. in all of my secrets and sins and struggles. And yet, at the same time, we're afraid that if we're fully loved, it's because we're not fully known. What we want is to be fully known and fully loved, and that can only be found in one person and in one place. In God. God knows you fully, loves you unconditionally. So all of the stuff that you try to hide from other people and can't, by the way, hide from God, He's okay with all that. Bring it all. Come, all of you, all of your broken parts, bring it. I'm here for all of it, He says. He's interested in you, and He meets you where you are. And while He never promised that He would rescue us from pain in this life, as I said before, He did promise to be with us in it. Nowhere in the Bible do we find God looking down on the sufferer. Never. He's never stiff upper-lipped when it comes to your pain. Ever. God doesn't sound like the people around us who are telling us to snap out of it, get over it, move on already. God isn't that way. He's patient with us in our pain. He's never stiff upper-lipped when it comes to our trouble. He's not indifferent to your aches. He never turns a deaf ear to the sufferer, and He never condemns us for our struggles. Never. When Isaiah refers to Jesus, speaking foretellingly of Jesus who was going to come, when Isaiah refers to Jesus as a wonderful counselor, you know what that phrase means literally, and I love this. It literally means the wonder counselor. But God alone is capable of counseling wonder to our deepest pains, to our most pervasive hurts. God Himself counsels wonder. He doesn't simply offer Band-Aid solutions to our deep problems or pat answers to our pain. He knows everything about us. He knows what you need. He knows your sins. He knows your secrets. He knows your fears. He knows your insecurities. He knows your deepest aches. He knows what discourages you. He knows you. He understands you. He understands your hopes and your fears. Your dreams, your longings are not anonymous to Jesus. He is a wonderful counselor. The Bible presents to the sufferer, that is you and me, a God who understands, a God who cares, a God who invites us to come to Him for help. A God who promises one day to end all suffering of any kind once and forever. That's the God that summons us in our seasons of pain. That's the God who promises to be with us in our crucibles of ache. It's the God who promises to never leave us when we're in trouble, to never abandon us in our dire time of need, ever. Everything about you, the stuff that you don't like, the stuff that you don't want anybody else to know. I've said this before, jokingly, but seriously, that if the people closest to you, I'm talking closest to you, spouse, kids, family members, parents, the people closest to you knew everything about you, everything that God knows, they would run for the hills. And they would probably get a restraining order because they would be fearful for their life, okay? I mean, one of the ways that I think we would all be much nicer to one another is if all of our sins and secrets and struggles were on billboards along the road with our name and our picture right next to it. We would not judge anybody anymore because we would be too busy trying to cover up our own blemishes. God knows all that stuff. He knows it. He's not surprised by it. He's not shocked by it. C.S. Lewis says in one of his books that God takes it for granted that we're not good. Okay? He's not asking you to sort of clean up your act before you come to Him. He's like, come on, I know better. I see you. I know you. And nothing about you deters me from loving you. Nothing. You can be who you are truly to me. You can take off your mask. You can stop pretending. So the Bible presents to the sufferer a God who understands and who cares and who invites you to cast all of your cares on him, to come to him for help. A God who promises that one day everything sad will come untrue. I want to close with this. A friend of mine wrote this and posted it yesterday on his social media, and I read it yesterday morning and thought it was just so good, so powerful, and so appropriate, not only for this time of year, but for the conclusion of this series. It's a short post that he titled, "Christmas in the Underworld." This is what he says. His name's Chad Bird, by the way. And I have to say that because I told him that I would be using this at the end of my sermon, and he said, "Thank you." So, Chad, this is a great piece. Thank you. You are always welcome here at the sanctuary. This is what he wrote. "As hard as it is to believe, though our world is shattered by evil, imploding by the second, Jesus is glad he came into our world. To us who need him, to us who whisper joy to the world through tears, to us who cling like castaways to any scrap of hope still floating in our shipwrecked lives. We say, 'I can't go on.' Jesus says, 'I will hold you so you can.' We say, 'But I don't think I can believe that.' Jesus says, 'Even when you are faithless, I will be faithful to you.' We say, 'But I feel so alone.' Jesus says, 'I am Emmanuel, God with you, God never leaving your side.' We say, 'But what's the point? My life is over.' Jesus says, 'I am your life, and I am never over.' We say, 'But look at what I've done. I'm dirty.' Jesus says, 'Look at what I've done for you. I've taken your dirt and I've smeared it all over me. You are clean. I am filthy. See me dirty on the cross. See you clean beneath it.' We say, 'Nobody wants me.' Jesus says, 'I want you. Desperately, lovingly, crazily, I want you.' And he does. No one twisted Jesus' arm to make him enter Mary's womb. No one tricked him into being born into a world strung out on the meth of sin. He came in with his eyes wide open and his heart too. A wide open heart big enough to hold the whole world. A wide open heart big enough to hold you in all of your messiness. Let's pray.